discussion how to get this scatter plot. I will show you, you can go slowly. I will ask you just to follow me. Let me show you from the very beginning what I should be doing from this. And I have the link already here about the world development indicators. Here we are in the world development indicators that my advice is a very powerful tool to analyze macroeconomic data. You have to do this activity for Mexico and from any other country. Therefore, let me look for Mexico here, and let me look for the United States here. So we have the two countries, the database world development indicator, and what we need to estimate a Phillips curve. A very simple task. It's not a real estimation of the Phillips curve. We need two key variables. The first one, inflation, and then you can type here, inflation. And let's see what options we have. Usually, when we're talking about these consumer prices, it's the consumer price index. This is the inflation that most of the time we're talking about in newspapers. This is inflation we're talking about in theory. This is inflation that different countries are estimating using a basket of goods and services that are representing the consumption in each country. This is what we need. The GDP deflator, this one, is something that we're using to remove the impact of inflation when we're estimating GDP. You know, we have GDP in real terms at constant prices versus GDP nominal or at current prices. Therefore, we know very well that this is inflation that we need. Not sure. Well, guys, here is an option. One click here, and you will find a clear definition of what does mean here, inflation, consumer prices, annual percent. And this definition would be useful to make a decision, right? We know this one. Now, more complicated because there are many other options. Unemployment. Last class, I told you go to the view, here is unemployment, and we have different kinds of measures of unemployment. Because actually unemployment is a very complex topic. And what you need to analyze the Phillips curve, what you need, inflation, consumer price, versus total unemployment. But you can see here unemployment according with education, could be unemployment according with gender, male, and also I told you there could be unemployment total, this is what we need, you can also look here, but could be an estimation based on the international level organization versus the estimate that is doing your local institution. In our case, this is in negative. My advice is better to use something like this. Would be very similar, but because we have two countries, well, just compare the same. We are using this, so use this for both countries. We are using this, use this for both countries. Therefore, we already got the two variables. Yeah, two: unemployment total, percentage of total labor force, and inflation. What else I need? Time. Something important for you overall. Always is better as much data you can get. Then later you can remove data that is not useful. But therefore, my advice, always ask for all the information that is available. We had 2023, and usually world development indicators is starting in 1960. So we got all these. Click here, apply change. And here it is in the case of Mexico. Inflation, you can see 2023, 5.5, just last year. 2022, 7.9. Unemployment, as I mentioned, in the case of Mexico, because of the Mexican conditions, is a very small number usually in comparison with developed countries. We had the US here, and you will see the US in the years of the pandemic, 8%. This is a big number because if we are assuming that frictional unemployment is about 5, that means that you had an employment of 3% affecting GDP, economic growth rate. And each increase in unemployment of 1% means a decrease of 2% in GDP economic growth rate. Therefore, the economic activity in the US on average should be falling this year about 6%. That is a big number for this kind of economies. Let me come back to Mexico. We are here. But the most important now is to download the data to be working on Excel. So Excel, let me put this here, save here. So now we have the data set here, and I will get focused just on the scatter plot because the other kind of graphs are very simple, are not so complicated. And here another general advice, when you don't have data, this is just affecting your estimations. Therefore, the simple thing to do is just to remove something like this. And you can do just quickly like here, reemplazar, look for these dots, and do nothing, yeah? So I'm removing all these dots because it will be affecting me. I had Mexico, and I had the variable. Therefore, actually, these two columns also are necessary for me. I can select that, and I can remove this one. Therefore, I had Mexico, I had inflation, unemployment, United States, inflation, and unemployment. And then you can, this kind of simple graph, when you are observing how this is behaving over time, are quite simple to get. And the question is, how can I get this scatter plot to be able to obtain a graph that will actually show me the relationship between inflation in the vertical axis and unemployment in the horizontal axis. This is the reason that also I noted that some of you had a wrong homework, because you can see that at least for the case of Mexico, unemployment is a small number. It should be something big, but big for Mexico means 7, 8, something like that. But inflation in the case of Mexico could be as big as more than 100, yeah? And I noted that some of you got something like that, a dot that is a combination of inflation and employment, but you don't have unemployment in the horizontal axis to actually observe what we're expecting from the Phillips Curve. The Phillips Curve is telling us that there is an inverse or negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. If you had a very high unemployment rate, that means that the inflation would be a small number. And by contrast, if you had a large number here, a big figure here, that means unemployment should be a small number. We already mentioned people still studying something like that. A few decades ago, actually, the evidence was against the Phillips Curve. We were living with stagflation. Stagflation means a very high inflation and a very high unemployment rate, and therefore, by contrast, you observe a positive relationship. Nevertheless, under some assumptions and taking into account your expectations about inflation, still is possible to find easily that there is a relationship between inflation and unemployment, and that relationship is negative. And this is very important because for policymakers, for politicians, it's highly important to show a low level of inflation and a low level of unemployment. But empirically, we found evidence that are suggesting that both things are moving in opposite directions. So your estimation should be something like this, should be getting something like that. This, in the case of the United States, we can do it because actually this estimation here is taking into account expectations about inflation. And my best expectation about what is coming with inflation is just inflation in the previous year. Something we can actually calculate. In addition, here, we are taking into account the fractional unemployment, the natural rate of unemployment. As I mentioned, the full employment assumption. So what is the distance between the unemployment that you're observing versus minus the fractional unemployment? As I mentioned, in many developed countries, 5% usually is considered to be this natural rate of employment, fractional unemployment. And therefore, the unemployment above these 5% is what should be explaining or should have a relationship with your inflation minus your expectations about inflation. Then in this simple equation means inflation of the previous year. Well, let me come back to Excel. Here, I remember, probably I will be wrong because I will bring this again for you. There are two traditional First, let me do it like that, and also will be simple for you. In the case of Mexico, we don't have all this data from here. You can see, when you don't have data, because we need a scatter plot, you need a pair, you need inflation and employment. So all this here is something that we cannot analyze. Then later I will remove that. Therefore, first, let me copy and paste, and do the option, this option, transponer here. Therefore, I have inflation here, is the year 1960. Double click, and you got all the years here. And unemployment, we don't have all these observations. And actually, we don't have this and this. And therefore, we can start actually to analyze Mexico from this year, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. So you can remove this data, because we just starve you when you try to estimate something like that. And therefore, let me remove this. And I got inflation and unemployment from this year to 2023 from Mexico. And I would like to analyze the relationship between unemployment and inflation, where unemployment is in the horizontal axis. That means the X variable. That means the explanatory variable, according with the graph. It's not compulsory like that, it's just by tradition, because still, as I mentioned, you need to find a theory that will tell you that it's unemployment what explains inflation, and it's not inflation what explains unemployment, and probably there is something else, and it's people who are studying this seriously. For us, we need just a simple estimation to see actually with this kind of numbers, with this kind of variables, we can find evidence or not against or in favor of the Phillips Curve. And here is one detail when you are using Excel, as I remember. If you try to look just for the graph, and let me do it just like that here and now, I'm selecting both variables. I'm not selecting years, guys. Then later you can explain what you are doing. You go here to insert that, and this option, scatter plot, graphical dispersion, you should be selecting something like this. And this is the mistake that probably many of you were doing, because as you can see here, these numbers are very, very big numbers. And this is not unemployment. Here is inflation. And here in the vertical axis, these small numbers, this is not inflation. You know that inflation in Mexico, at least even from the 90s, is a very big number. Therefore, it doesn't make any sense. It's not the traditional Phillips Curve we are looking for. Because according with the traditional Phillips Curve we're looking for, it should be looking like this: unemployment here, inflation here. Yes, of course, it doesn't matter. You can say, inflation is here in the horizontal axis, unemployment in the vertical axis, and then you have to explain that by contrast, you should not be expecting this negative slope, you should be expecting a positive slope to find evidence in favor of the Phillips Curve. But let's do it as Phillips, and therefore, don't forget, in Excel, it's very important that you put as first column what is in the horizontal axis. So let me copy and paste this here and here. And now I have unemployment here and I have inflation here. And now I can do it. I can go to insert tab, my expression graph here. And now you can start editing this. Yeah, I will not spend time editing with the addition of this graph. But now for sure, guys, you can see that in this graph, we had inflation in the vertical axis, and we had unemployment here in the horizontal axis. And the question is, these dots, a combination of inflation and unemployment, showed evidence in favor or against the Phillips Curve. In favor of Phillips Curve, we should get something like that, a negative relationship. And in Excel, you have an option to do it. You can select one of these dots, then right button of your mouse, and you have an option to aggregate this, aggregate a tendency line. Actually, this is some kind of very simple regression analysis, because we're estimating the line that best fit for these dots. One click here, and you will get the options. We're expecting, and it's the most simple, to get just a linear relationship, to get something like that. Other things is possible, more complicated, and unnecessary for you. And I also will ask, the equation is here. Show me the equation also. Let me close this. And now what we got here, guys, this is an equation representing the Phillips curve with very simple data about inflation, consumer price index, and unemployment, total unemployment in this country, as is in this country, with all the discussion that we mentioned about this country, where informality is many times more important, and you got something like this. If you got something like this in your homework, that is what I'm looking for. Everybody about Mexico should be able to get something like that. Otherwise, it's wrong. Why this is important, guys? Do it quickly because it's to me to be very important. As you can see, there is not evidence in favor of Phillips curve. Before I go ahead, there is not evidence about for Phillips curve. By contrast, there is a positive relationship. When unemployment is increasing, inflation is also increasing. Yeah. What means this X here? X is unemployment. What this means Y here? Y is inflation. What means this number minus 0.5? Well, that is the intercept. This line is coming here, and will be very close to minus 1.5. Is the intercept crossing here the vertical edges. What does mean this number 2.6? That is the slope. Remember I told you in the introduction to economic science, what is a slope? How to estimate a slope? And you did before we start this semester with a very simple estimation of y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. Guys, this is for textbook to understand the idea. In practice, we are doing something like this as econometric solutionist to try to estimate this slope, the slope of this line. And what I'm telling you here, that when X, unemployment is increasing in 1 unit, when unemployment rate increases in 1 unit, then inflation is increasing in 2.6. If inflation rate increases 2.6, when unemployment increases in 1 unit, this is how you should be reading something like that. Here, you have your fair estimation of the Phillips curve. It's not correct, it's not accurate, it's people really studying this seriously. This is just for the classroom. Let me show you something else that in my opinion will be interesting. Because I will try to get this one, as in your textbook, taking into account there is a fractional unemployment, taking into account that there is an expectation about inflation is coming. Because here in the textbook, Dornbusch is using inflation and unemployment rate for the case of the US. We can do it just as in the case of Mexico, but let's try to go ahead and let's try to do something else. It seems that in the case of the US, we had all the information that is necessary for over all these decades. So very nice, actually. And the first thing we have to do is to change these variables in a column. I remember that sometimes Excel has troubles with that, and therefore the first thing, transponer. Now we have here in 1960, in 1961, just because later it's possible to edit the graph and you will get something really beautiful. So I had inflation and employment. What I told you, unemployment is always first. Therefore, I had to remove
Teacher,
inflation.
Can you please go slower, please?
Yes. I'm doing exactly the same, just for the case of the United States, because I would like to get exactly as in your textbook, something that should be looking like that in favor of Phillips curve. What I have been doing, because I don't know exactly how to say that in English, is transponer, to transport the rows information in columns. Don't forget, for Excel, when you are looking for the scatter plot, the first column is always the horizontal axis, and the second column is always the vertical axis. This is the reason I copy and paste from here to have the order that Excel is expecting. Then I will be selecting these two columns. But don't forget, actually, it's not unemployment what is important. What is important according with this equation is unemployment minus what you finish frictional unemployment. I'm not sure how Dornbusch was calculating that. I know that overall many economists agree that unemployment minus the unemployment that is frictional usually is this number. Therefore, I use equals this number minus 5%. Usually it's just like that. Let me agree. Let me assume that unemployment, that is the natural rate of employment in the case of the US, is 5%. And actually this number is what is here, or should be very close to what is here. I have this number and I have to estimate this epsilon. That should be a negative slope. And now inflation is my inflation minus the inflation of the previous year. This inflation, let me use just I as an expectation of my, important for me. I'm telling you that my best expectation about inflation, let's assume we're living in this year, 1960. And the question is, what will be the inflation in 1961? And I will tell you that my best expectation for that, it is what's happening in the 1960s, what is happening here. If somebody's asking me, Professor, what do you think about inflation next year? 2024, here. Well, I can have a very nice model, econometric model. I can tell you with theory and so on, and I can tell you, you know, the number is this one. Well, very nice. Actually, could be quite powerful, even complicated. But the simple answer is, you know, my best expectation about inflation coming in 2024 is just what happened in 2022. And we had evidence that actually is a good way to predict what is coming. But for this moment, because we try to estimate this equation here, let me assume just like that, because this is what Dornbusch is doing. It's using as the best expectation what happened in the past. And therefore I will be missing one observation because I need my inflation this year minus my inflation the previous year, right? Like this. I have to come down. I'm not using Excel frequently, guys. So sorry, I also not so good as you, as I mentioned before. As you should be. It should be really very limited. So here you can see is my inflation of my unemployment of this year minus 5, because I'm assuming that 5% is the natural rate of employment. You go down, and it's the same. This minus 5. This is. And this one is this minus this. Therefore, I will be losing this year as an observation. Oh, now it's working. And now I have this minus this equals this. And this means this minus this to get this one, right? And therefore, I got these two. Sorry. I got this one, unemployment minus frictional unemployment, natural rate unemployment, and I got this one, inflation minus my expectation about inflation. It's inflation of the previous year. And this, looking for this scatter plot, should be looking as this one. And therefore here, there is evidence in favor of Phillips if we are doing something like that. In other words, let me copy and paste here, just to clarify here. In other words, if you want to find evidence in favor of Phillips, you need to take into account your expectations and to have a good idea of what kind of unemployment rate in your country is just frictional. Insertar graphical expression, and it's selected the slot and will be in favor, guys. Agregar línea de tendencia, liner, and I want the equation also. It's not exactly as there because I had more years than Dornbusch is using. Probably I'm not using exactly the same figures, but now I find evidence in favor of Phillips. Here is the equation. Let me see, I can increase the size of this one. Now, guys, according to this exercise, as I mentioned, it's not looking exactly as in your textbook, but you can see that it's very close to that. We have these negative numbers. This means deflation. And you can see that actually it looks very similar. It's not the same because most probably Dornbusch is not using the same amount of years. I don't know what is the last number he's using here, because frictional employment could be slightly different. But we got something very similar to this, and we found evidence in favor of Phillips Curve. It is true, when you are taking into account your expectations about inflation and the frictional unemployment in your country, that there is a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. It's not nice. As a policy maker, you would like to show a very low number in unemployment and a very low number in inflation. But it's not happening. It's not so simple like that. You need to be careful in manipulating something like that. For instance, today, we are again fighting against inflation, decreasing the interest rate. We will discuss that later. Yeah. Well, if you are decreasing inflation, you should know that when inflation is coming down, unemployment is going up, and vice versa. Yeah. When unemployment is coming down, inflation is going up. Ceteris paribus. What means ceteris paribus? When all other variables affecting the relationship between inflation and unemployment are constant. This is not happening. It's more complicated. We have many other strategies. People working in the Treasury Department and Hacienda at the Central Bank of Mexico, at the Federal Reserve, so they had very nice estimations, something like that. And then these people at the university level, academics with a focus on something like that. This is not my area of expertise, but it's something very simple you can analyze. Now, how to read something like this? First, this is a constant, it's an intercept. The line that I'm estimating here is departing from 0.42. Let me see if it's possible to observe something like that here. Here is the intercept. Here is this number, 0.42. My line is departing from here. It's coming here to this sector, but it's also coming here. From here, it's departing this line. What is the slope of this line? My estimation of the slope of this line is not y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. No, we have estimation given these dots, and this is the slope, la pendiente de la línea. And what is the slope? First, very important, it's a negative number. You can see that the relationship is negative. And then the slope is telling me how much is changing my dependent variable, my inflation, my variable here in the vertical axis, when x, the explanatory variable, in this case unemployment, is changing in 1 unit. Therefore, if x equals 1, that means that inflation is decreasing by minus 0.41. And therefore, it's a negative relationship. It's clear, guys? It's better? You got it?